I don't normally fall into fear, but something happened to me 40 years ago that has never left me. And for many, many years after this happened, I couldn't talk about it because I would begin to get such bad chills and sort of shake all over that I knew I wasn't supposed to tell the story. And slowly that eased, and I began to tell the story, not very often, but if it felt like the right time to tell it. So now I feel completely comfortable telling it, even though I still don't quite understand what happened. But I'll let you be the judge of that. So I was in my early 20s. I was living in New York City. I was going to Columbia University for graduate school. And I was also working part-time at a startup magazine. And this was a startup magazine started by a woman from Boulder, Colorado. And she was an old hippie. She was an old hippie with a kind of very entrepreneurial spirit. And she wanted to create a magazine that would be like Parade magazine. I don't know if any of you, if it's still even around, but it was a free magazine in newspapers every Sunday. But her idea was to have a magazine called Vision magazine, and it would be all things new, all things, cutting edge, very new agey idea. Even though this was 40 years ago, she really had her eye on what was going to be happening next. So the magazine was a failure. But at that time we thought, hey, this is really possible. It might be great. It was going to be supported by advertisers. So a woman came from Colorado to work with us who was kind of a secretarial kind of type. Her name was Gloria. And she was very nice, and she sort of glommed onto me. Even we were, there's probably a 20 to 30 year age difference, but we became very good friends in the office. And she began to expose me to all kinds of ideas. So I was already steeped in, a lot of Eastern tradition thinking and philosophy. I was steeped in Edgar Cayce. There weren't a lot of writers that wrote about this kind of stuff in those days, but I was very interested. And she said, oh, well, I have a friend who channels an entity and you need to talk to her. She's going to be coming to New York City in a couple of months. And I said, okay, I'd never heard of channeling before. I mean, this was when there were no channelers. And she said her name is Sheila Gillette, and she channels an entity named Theo. Now, I'm sure all of you have, if you're watching this, have probably heard of Theo at this point. I had not heard of him. There was no internet. There was no book. She just said, oh, she makes private appointments with people and answers any question under the sun that you want to ask. What is the meaning of my life? Have I been reincarnated before? Do I have some special thing I'm supposed to do with this life? You can ask her anything. And I was so excited. I was like, oh my God, to talk to an entity from another world, purely from spirit, and I can ask anything. And I was very excited. I began to carry around a little notebook, putting in all my questions, and being very excited. So we had this appointment coming up in about a month or two. But something really weird began to happen at the same time, which was I began to feel really strange, especially when I'd come home to my apartment at night. I felt as if something was following me, like a ghost or an energy. And it was my first experience with this, but I felt this coldness in the back of my neck often, kind of waves of this coldness. And I didn't know what it was, but I finally was like, I think I'm being followed around by a ghost. It didn't make any sense, but I was like, maybe I am. And I began to not be able to sleep very well at night. I began to feel as if I was being haunted, and I had a little son who was only 2 or 3 years old at that time. And I was kind of worried for him, and I wasn't able to live a normal life. I was so freaked out all the time. And I told my mother I was having kind of a hard time. And at the time, she lived in an artist colony in upstate New York called Yaddo, which is actually a place that's famous for many ghosts. But she was the temporary director for 1 year there. And one Friday morning, I had woken up from a very bad night. And I'll tell you about the very bad night. This is the part that's hard to describe. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a complete jolt, sat straight up in bed, and felt as if some energy, some heavy energy, was trying to go straight into my throat and chest. And I yelled out aloud to I don't know who, "What do you want?" Very loud voice. And then I yelled, "No, no," very fiercely. I didn't wake my son up, but I'm sure I could have. Anyway, I was like, "What do you want?" "No." And I turned the light on and began to breathe, and slowly the feeling left me. It was very scary. I felt as if something was trying to come into me. So when I woke up, the phone rang, and my mother said, "Would you and Charlie like to come up to Yaddo this weekend?" And I was like, "Yeah, I don't want to be alone. I would love to come." And to this day, my son will tell me that morning going to the train station was one of the scariest mornings of his life. I don't quite know why. I think we were about to miss the train and we had to run, but he really associated it with terror. So we get up to Yaddo, and it turns out my mother is having a cocktail party at her house on the grounds of Yaddo because it's the new guests are arriving. This is a place where artists and writers and painters and musicians come and spend between 2 weeks and a few months. In the old days, it was free. I don't know if it's still free, but there's an application process. So these parties are usually incredibly fun because you meet all sorts of people. So she had the cocktail party, and all the new guests were there, and I was just sort of standing in the corner of the room, feeling very like a ghost myself. And this old man came across the room over to me, and he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, I don't know, just blurted it out. I said, "I think I'm being followed around by a ghost." And he was like, "Oh, well, why don't we see if that's true? Let's go in the other room and we can do a little work together." It's like, okay. So we went in the other room, and he pulled out a pendulum, which was not something I'd ever seen before. And he told me his name was William Lederer, and he had written a book called The Ugly American. And after he had written that book, he had gone to India and studied with the Sufis and I tried to look him up a few years ago. I couldn't find any information on this, but he did some kind of philosophical, some kind of study in India. Anyway, he took out his pendulum. He's like, yeah. And he said, "I'm going to ask if there is an entity indeed following you around." And he said, "Yes, there is." He got that information somehow. "Yes, there is. He's a sort of a mischiefy young man." And I was like, okay. And then he said, "His name is Theo." And I was like, what? I hadn't told anybody that I was going to be talking to this Theo entity. It's like, he says his name is Theo. And he said, he doesn't really mean any harm. And I said, well, I don't like it. I don't want him around me. And he told me, he said, I'll tell him that he needs to leave you alone. And he said, in the meantime, sleep with your light on at night. And when you feel him, just say, no, thank you. It's nothing to be afraid of, but just say, no, thank you. And so that's how it went. So I said, thank you. And then slowly over time, over the next few days, I began to feel a little bit better. I slept with my light on, etc. And when I got back to New York, as I walked into my apartment, the phone was ringing, and it was Gloria. And I answered it, and she said, "We have to cancel your Theo appointment. Do you want to reschedule or something?" And I said, "No, thank you. I do not. I don't want any part of it." And then maybe 30 years later, I was listening to an Abraham Hicks recording, and Sheila, Gillette, and Theo are the ones who taught Esther and Jerry to channel Abraham. So that's my story. I don't know what to make of it even now. Thank you for listening. This was very long. If you made it to the end, you're a hero. Bye.